New- Okay, Bez Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Zvachim 42. And we're just holding on the bottom of 41b Mesvei. Um, just a quick little overview of what we're discussing over here. Pretty simple. Um, Here is what's called, it doesn't look like it, but it's called the the mincha that a Jew brings. So as you're familiar with, the kohen will do a kamitza in the flour, right? And then puts it into a kli sharis. And then as part of the mincha, there was frankincense. I think it's levoina, and they put that into this kli sharis. And you know what they're going to do with this kli sharis, with the kmitza and the levoina? They're going to throw it onto the mizbeach. They throw the kmitza first, and then they throw the levoina, and they burn it on the mizbeach. And that was a mincha flour that was brought by a Jew who wanted to make a donation. And they baked the flour into matzah, and that was eaten by the Kahanim. So says the Chumash. Now, what happens if you have a bad thought by, let's say, throwing of the kmitza and did not have the bad thought by throwing of the levina? So we learned in yesterday's daf, the following statement. Let's just make this bigger. In the following yesterday's daf, we found this machlokes between Rameir and the Chachamim, and it's very important. Rameir says if you just think a bad thought by the kamitza, but not by the frankincense, when you're throwing that on the mizbeach, so or you do levina without the kamitza, so then Rameir says it's pigel and yechayev kares. That says Rameir. Now, the truth is that the avoida of being makter you have to do both of them. The kamitza and the levina has to be thrown on the mizbeach. And if you do one without the other, you're not yotze. And yet, Rameir says if you have a bad thought called a pigel thought by the kamitza, even though you had a good thought by the levina, it's still considered pigel and you chayav kares. And Chachamim says no, ein by kares. Chachamim say that there's no chorus over here until you have a bad thought by the pigel and by the kmitza and the levoina. But having a bad thought by half the avoida doesn't work. Okay, that's the quiz. So Rab Shmuel Bar Yitzchak's understanding of the Gemara is very simple. Rab Meir says mefaglim b'chatzi matir here on the bottom. You could make pigel even if you have bad thought on half the avoida. I would say, let's say by shchita, you have to, for example, you have to shech two simonim, the windpipe and the food pipe. If I have a bad thought by shechting the windpipe, according to Rab Meir, that will make it pigel. According to Chachamim, no, you have to have a bad thought by both the windpipe and the food pipe. So same thing over here. You have to have a bad thought by both, by throwing of the flour on the mizbeach, and by throwing the levoin on the mizbeach, you have to have a bad thought. But one without the other would not make it a pigel. Comes along Rav Shimon ben Lakish, and he says a new reason of Rameir. Rameir would agree you can't have a bad thought on a half a service doesn't render it pigel, but it renders here pigel because here we're talking about he had a bad thought by the flour. Let's say he had the bad thought by the flour, and then he didn't think anything by throwing the frankincense on the mizbeach. So whoever does the second avoida, he's basing his thought on the first, on what he thought about during the first part of the avoida. And since he did it, he did the avoida. The first part of the avoida was done with a pigel thought. So even if you didn't think anything by the second part of the avoida, it is also will render it pigel. That's what he says. First, you did the kamitza with the bad thought of pigel thought, and then you threw the levina, not thinking anything. Rameir says, "Kola oisa al das rishaynu oisa," and that's the reason of Rameir, because when you do the second thing of levina, you're thinking that it should be connected to what you thought about during the kamitza, and that's why it's pigel. And Chachamim says no. You have to have a bad thought, a pigel thought by the Kmitza and the Levina. So the Gemara over here, Amim Aleph and Beis, is going to ask a question on Rabbi Shlokish's understanding of Rameir. So Rabbi Shlokish's understanding of Rameir is that kol ha'oisa al das rishaynu ha'oisa. Rameir doesn't agree of chatzi hamatir, that just having a bad thought on a half an avoida that makes the carbon piggle. It's not true. So now, Mesve, let me ask you a question. When do we say, the Brisa says like this, when do we say that if you have a bad thought just by one sprinkling, then you destroy the whole carbon? Bidomim hanitanen al mizbeach hachitzon. Only those carbonas that are placed on the outside mizbeach. A regular carbon, they sprinkle it on the outside mizbeach. Let's say a carbon chatas, you sprinkle it on the four corners of the outside mizbeach. Avol, but now this you remember from Yom Kippur. Let's bring up the illustration over here. On Yom Kippur, let's say Yom Kippur, there were sprinklings inside the sanctuary, right? Inside the sanctuary, and first there was a sprinkling by the par and the so'ir, 8 sprinklings in front of in the Kodesh Kodashim, each, right? 8 sprinklings each. Then they made 8 sprinklings, 8 each for the cow and the so'ir. This is number 2, outside by the paroiches. Then they sprinkled on the mizbeach, on the 4 corners of the mizbeach, and then they did a sprinkling on the top of the mizbeach, but all in the mizbeach hapnimi. So here, with the one carbon, with the carbon, you could have more than just 4 sprinklings. You could have a bunch of sprinklings. There, in order to pass on the carbon, you have to have a bad thought by each and every one of those bloods. That's what he says. We go on to Membeis Amid Aleph. Avo, but damim hanitanim al mizbeach hapnimi, blood that's given on the inside mizbeach. Kegoin, what's an example of carbonas that are in the inside mizbeach? Abar v'shalosh yom kippurim, the 43 bloods that you put on in Yom Kippur, which are brought in the sanctuary. If you count them up between the bloods of both animals, the cow, the par, and the sa'ir, the goat, they were brought inside the Kodesh Kodashim on the paroiches and twice on the mizbeach, on the corners, and you get 43 sprinklings. V'achad also shapar Mashiach, v'achad also shapar helam davar shatzibur. These par kai Mashiach and the cow of par helam davar shatzibur, those 2 cows, the blood was brought inside the sanctuary, but not in the Kodesh Kodashim. There they had 11 sprinklings. So technically, according to the Chachamim will hold, we'll see in a second, that in order to make the carbon a pigel carbon, you have to have a bad thought by all 43 spots, all 11 sprinklings, because they're one big avodah, and you have to do all of them. You see, with the mizbeach achitzain, if you do one, you will to the carbon. So therefore, the rest are, you get an extra mitzvah, but they're not necessary. Here, every drop of blood, every sprinkle is necessary. So in order to make the carbon pigel, you have to have a kavanah on each and every one. But Rav Meir is going to say like this: pigel, bein barishayno, bein b'shniya, bein b'shlishis. Let's say you made pigel, whether you did the pigel was in the set that was going into the Kodesh Kodashim, or bein b'shniya, whether you did the set, you had a pigel not while what was done in the Kodesh Kodashim, but you did well. But you had a pigel thought on the stuff that you did outside on the paroiches, or bein b'shlishis, or you had a pigel thought by the 3rd set. Let's see it on the picture. Very simple. You had according to Meir, if you had a pigel thought over here, then everything is possible. But if you have a pigel thought just by number 2, but by pigel thought by when you did it in the Kodesh Kodashim, the Kohen Gadol did it and Kodesh did it correctly. He thought a pigel thought by the 2nd one, or let's say he only thought a pigel thought when he got to the 3rd part of the mizbeach. right? That's when he said a pigel thought. Says Rav Meir, pigel, the whole carbon is pigel, the chiyavin al karas. If you eat it, you get karas. Chachamim says, Ein boy karas ad sheyifagel b'chol hamatir. Rabbi Shimon say it's not pigel until you had pigel thoughts on all the sprinklings of blood. So now, but you see, Rab Meir seems to say that even if you have a partial pigel thought on an avoida, the whole thing becomes puzzle. Katana meal, pigel, bein b'rishayna, bein b'shnio, bein b'shlishis, upalig. Rab Meir says just by having a pigel thought by the group 2, or even by just group 3, you mafagel the whole carbon, even though the rest of the bloods you did good. So we see Rab Meir's real opinion BSB, because Rab Meir holds you could be mefagel b'chatzi hamatir. Just having a pigel thought on a half of avoida makes the whole carbon puzzle, not the way Rish Lakish taught us. Answers the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak is saying, Baravin, Hacha b'mayaskinen. Here we're discussing Kigoin shepigel b'shchita dechad materhu. Here is a strange thing. The Bryce is talking about where after the Kohen Gadol did, let's say, the first sprinkling normally in front of the Kodesh Kodashim, right? Then the blood spilled out. The blood of the cow just spilled on the floor. So you had to shech the new cow to sprinkle on the paroiches. So that is a complete avoida. So if he had a bad thought while slaughtering the cow, a new cow for the second sprinkling, that will make it, because it's a standalone cow, and therefore it can, just by thinking a bad thought on that cow, would passel the whole carbon. That's what he's saying. It's one a complete avoida. It's not related to what was done in the Kodesh Kodashim, and therefore, according to Rameir, it becomes pigel. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, my time of the Rabbanim, then why would the Rabbanim hold it's not pigel? Since you're using a brand new animal for the second set of sprinklings, so it's one avoida, and therefore, why would the Chachamim hold that it's, if you just have a bad thought by that second set, it's not pigel? Amar Rava is going to answer, Man Chachamim Rabbi Lezer. That Chachamim is an opinion of Rabbi Lezer, and Rabbi Lezer is like an extended opinion. He holds that the Tanam we learned in the Mishnah, Hakoymetz Valavoyne Vakatoris Minchas Kahanam Minchas Koyin Mashiach Minchas Nesachem Shikav Ma'achas Men Kazayas B'chutz Chaya. Let's say the koimitz or the voina, right? The koimitz, the flour that's supposed to go on the mizbeach. If you took an olive's worth of that koimitz, that flour that's supposed to go on the mizbeach, and you brought it onto fire outside the base of English, you get a big aver. You get the chayiv karas. Reb Lezer says it's pata achi yakrav es kulam, until you do the entire. So according to Reb Lezer, in order for you to be chayiv kares, you have to bring the whole what's ever in the bowl outside the base of it. Not just the kazayas, but even if you do only if you brought the whole bowl outside the base of Migdash and was makriv it somewhere else, that's when you're chayiv. So what you see from there is that Rabbi Lezer poite achi yakrav kulam. So we see from there Rabbi Lezer is very strict. He says that since everything is included in the kapara of this koimitz, it's looked at as one entity. You can't break it up into different entities. So Rabbi Lezer is going to say that even if I brought a new carbon to makriv because the blood spilled out, and I'm bringing a new carbon to do the sprinkling on the paroiches, according to Rabbi Lezer, that's part of the overall service of the kahanim of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So therefore, you can't view it as a separate matir. It's part of all the other sprinklings, and therefore, if you just have pigel by that paroiches type of, if you just have pigel by the shchita of the blood that's going to the paroiches, it would not passel the carbon. Says the Gemara, is that true? Rabba said, Rabbi Lezer would agree by bloods, you can break it apart. That now we learned in the Mishnah, Reb Lezer, Reb Shimon Omer. Reb Lezer, Reb Shimon says, let's say the blood, while the kohen is in the Kodesh Kodashim, all of a sudden he's sloppy, and the blood spilled on the floor. And he did only 3 sprinklings. And how many sprinklings are you supposed to do in the Kodesh Kodashim? 8. So now that you're going to go out, he's going to shecht a new par. Where does he start from? So the Chachamim say you start from the beginning. You have to do 8 again. Rabbi Lezer, Shimon, since you're doing a brand new carbon, by blood, you say from wherever you stop, that's where you start. So if you stop by number 3, you continue from number 3. Bottom line is, you see, Reb Lezer is of the opinion that once you're bringing a new animal into the picture over here, because the other animal, the blood spilled on the floor, so that becomes an entity for itself, separate from everything else. And therefore, you could be mefagel, you couldn't make it pigel just by focusing in on the shechita of that one. So bottom line is, the Gemara doesn't have an understanding of this brisa. This brisa seems to question Rab Shlokish's understanding of Rab Meir, because this brisa says, Rab Meir said that just by having a pigel thought, by sprinkling of the blood on the paroiches, even if you had a good thought by sprinkling of the blood by the Kodesh Kodashim, the whole carbon is pigel. And Rav Shlokish doesn't agree with that understanding of Rav Meir. So how are we going to explain Rav Meir away? So the Gemara tries a new approach. Ella Amar Rava says, Kegoin shepigel b'rishayna. Really, he had a bad thought. The Bryce is talking about, he had a bad thought by the first sprinkling. The Kohen Gadol had a bad thought when he's sprinkling in the Kodesh Kodashim. And the Bryce is saying, V'shosek b'shniya. He didn't think of anything by the sprinkling of the paroiches. So by the sprinkling of the paroiches, he didn't think of anything. So again, according to where Shlokish's understanding is, that not thinking is basically saying, I'm relying what I thought about in the Kodesh Kodashim. So now it's pigel. But then he had a pigel thought by number 3. He actually had a verbal pigel thought by number 3. So then the answer is, the whole carbon is pigel. So, because my would the same, I would have thought, if you hold that the second sprinkling is based on what he thought about the first sprinkling, why did he have to think about doing why did he have to repeat it and say, I'm doing a pigel thought when he did the third set of sprinklings on the Mizbeach? It must be that he's never relying on what he thought in the previous step. And because of that, therefore, I might think he only had a pigel thought by 1 and 3, and 2 is kosher. And it should not be pigel. Kamash malam, that it is pigel. That he was always relying on what he thought about in the beginning. Okay, so that is, again, because Rish Lakish does not want to have Rab Meir saying that just by thinking a pigel thought in a half a avoida, you passel the whole carbon. It can't be that's Rab Meir's opinion. It must be that Rab Meir's opinion is, it's as if you had a pigel thought on the entire process. And what's the chiddush of this brisa? Is that even though you didn't think anything by step number 2, you only thought a pigel thought by step number 1 and step number 3, the whole carbon is puzzle, because we'll assume that step number 2 was relying on what you thought about by step number 1. That's the way you understand the brisa. Maskef lo Rav Ashi says, Midi Shasa Katani, does it say that he didn't think anything by the second sprinkling? It says if he had a pigel thought by the second sprinkling. So the Brisa doesn't say that he was quiet by the second sprinkling. Elam Rashi, you have to read the Brisa like this. Now remember, there are 4 real steps over here. There's 1, sprinkling in the Kodesh Kodashim; 2, sprinkling on the paroiches; 3, sprinkling on the corners of the Mizbeach; and then 4, sprinkling on the top of the Mizbeach. So the Gemara says, Ella Amarava, Rava says, he had a pigel thought on the first, second, and third. And now, the 4th one, he was quiet. So Ma'u the same Isa Kadait Das Rishaynu Mahada Pigel Shlishus Lamali. Then why, if he was quiet on the 4th one, it's considered as if he had a pigel thought on the 4th one. But why? The fact that if he's always relying on the previous step, what he thought about, then why did he have to say by the second step and the third step, he's thinking pigel thoughts? It must be that we don't rely on the previous step. I would think so. That's what it says. I would say, why do you have to say a pigel thought by step one, step two, step three? He could have just a pigel thought by the Kodesh Kodashim, and that would have taken care of everything. Kamash Malan, no, that even if he said the pigel thought out loud by steps one and step two and step three, even if he's quiet by step four, the whole carbon is considered a pigel carbon. We go to Ahmed Bays. So Gemara of a Bain Katani. But doesn't the Brisa say that he had an independent pigel thought by step two and an independent pigel thought by step three, not connected to step one? Kasha, this will be difficult against Rish Lakish's understanding. But again, point to walk away with. Rish Lakish does not want Meir to say that just having a pigel thought on a half of avoida, that passes the carbon. The only time you can have a pigel thought is if you passel the whole avoida. So if something needs a two-step process, like by the mincha, if the way it works is that you had a bad thought by the kamitza, when you threw the kamitza on the mizbeach. So even if you didn't have any thought when you threw the levina on the mizbeach, but it's based off what you were thinking about when you threw the kamitza on the mizbeach, so the whole mincha will be a pigel mincha. Now the Gemara asks another question. Amama, Rameir says pigel the chayavin alero kares. That once you again, if you learn that Rameir holds. Now, if you don't learn like Rish Lakish, and Rameir holds that once you have a pigel thought, already the carbon is disqualified because Rameir holds even by a partial avoid, if you have a pigel thought, the whole thing is disqualified. Pigel, the chayavin kares. You have to do everything properly. The amama kartoi is kosher, kachatoi is possible. The same way a carbon goes kosher, so also that's the way a carbon could become pigel. Mahartzoy is kosher, just like when you want to make a kosher carbon. Achi krivi kol matirav, you have to do all the steps correctly. Af hartzoy is possible. Achi krivi kol matirav, you have to do to make it possible. You have to do everything correctly. Now here's the question. The question is, let's say by step two you had a pigel thought. How could a mayor say that everything is pigel? But when you made a pigel thought by this blood, and then you took the blood to step number three, the same blood, that's not blood anymore. That's like water because it's now pus blood, and therefore the whole carbon cannot become pus because you didn't finish the job correctly. That's the Gemara's question. That's the Gemara's question. Kiva the chashabei b'fnim psula commandolei aididami. Since let's say if you had a bad thought by the Kodesh Kodashim, it's as if you didn't sprinkle it there. When you're going to sprinkle by the Pareiches or by the Mizbeach, you're sprinkling just water. So how are you making this carbon possible? So Amar Rabba gives us interesting tarets. It's talking about the only way to make it pigel is if you used 4 cows and 4 goats. In other words, every step that you had the blood, it spilled on the floor, and you had to bring a new cow and goat for step number 2. You had to bring a new cow and goat for step number 3, and a new cow and goat for step number 4. So each one is viewed independently, and only then you get the pigel problem. That would be Reb Meir's chiddush over here. But Rava says, "Afila teba para echa v'sori echad lipigulei miratza." Even if you brought 1 cow and 1 goat, but what it means is, in order to make something pigel, is you have to go through the motions of doing everything correctly, and then it becomes pigel. Even though true, the parvin is possible right away when you had a bad thought by step number 2. But if you continue to step number 3 and step number 4 and act as if nothing is wrong, then you take this carbon a step further. Not only is it a puzzle carbon, but it's a pigel tigger carbon that if someone would eat it, they would get karas. And that's how Rava would say it. Now the Gemara just adds 2 questions. Aboim b'sholish. We said that there are 43 that you do on Yom Kippur. Says the Gemara of Atanya Bar V'Sheva. Didn't we learn that there's 47? There's another brisa that says 47. Answers the Gemara, hard command over Ma'arvin Lakronis, hard command over Ein Ma'arvin Lakronis. That means that true, on step number one, let's count it, you have 8, right? You have 8 for the cow, 8 for the goat, so that's 16. Then step number 2 is 8 for the cow, 8 for the goat, that's 32. Step number 3, if you mix the cow and the goat, right, by step number 3, you only have 4 sprinklings. So 32 plus 4 is 32 plus 4 is 36. Then when you put 7 on top of the mizbeach, you have 43. So that makes sense, 43. But that's because you mix the bloods together before you did put it on the corners. But if you hold that you don't mix the bloods of the cow and the goat together, but you do 4 for the cow and then 4 for the goat, then you'll have 47. And that's how that other brisa squares away. Says the Gemara of Otanya Abon Shmoina. But then we have another brisa that says there's 48. And says the Gemara, Hoda Amanda Amma Shrai Ma'akvin, Hokamanda Amma ain't Shrai Ma'akvin. One opinion holds that there's another step after all this blood's in the sanctuary. You have to take the extra blood and pour it on the outside mizbeach. And that's an extra step. That's why there's 48. But there's an opinion that says you don't have to do that. And therefore, it remains with 47. So you got either 47, 43, 47, 43, or 48. That's the difference. One last point, and then we'll stop. Meisvei, the Gemara asks a question. Avo, let's look at this part of this brisa. If you want to be makter, if you put the koimitz on the mizbeach with a bad thought, and the levoina you were quiet, or you put the koimitz without a bad thought, not saying anything. That's a levoina b'machshava, and then you did the levoina with a bad thought. Rameir oim a pigel v'chayvel and kares v'chama me'ein by kares achifaga b'cholamater. Ketonomia, but we have a partial thought. As a koimitz b'shtika, if you first did the koimitz normally, right? You put the koimitz on the mizbeach normally, the flour on the mizbeach normally. That's a levoina machshava. Then you had a bad machshava just by the second part, by part number 2, by putting the frankincense on the mizbeach, you had a bad thought. Rab Meir says it's pigel. So we see that Rab Meir holds that you can make something pigel even having a bad thought on the half of the avodah. This is against Rish Lakish. And it says the Gemara, Eima kvar nosam levoina b'machshava. That means here we're talking about you did the levoina first with a bad thought, and then you did the kamitza. You did it reverse. You put the levoina first with a bad thought, and then you did the kamitza, even though it doesn't seem to say that. Says the Gemara Chada, the Gemara asks, if that's the point of the Mishnah, the Hainuration, that is what the first case is, where the first one you did incorrectly, and the second step you did correctly. Void, Tanya, we learned in a brisa, va'achakach. A brisa says clearly that this case is that you first put the koimitz normally, and ba'achakach you put the levoina with a bad thought. And there Rab Meir says pigel. So it must be Rish Lakish has it all wrong. Rab Meir is of the opinion that you could make a carbon puzzle pigel with a bad thought on half the avodah. Kasha, this is a question against Rish Lakish's understanding of Rab Meir. Okay, Bez Hashem, tomorrow we'll begin with a brand new Mishnah.